In 1960, America was 85% white of European descent, Protestant and Catholic, sharing a common language, a common culture, and for better or worse, a common story. Today, that number is 58% and falling. In one generation, the United States underwent the single largest demographic transformation in the history of any nation on earth, larger than the fall of Rome, larger than the Moorish conquest of Spain, larger than anything that has ever happened to any civilization ever without a war. And it all traces back to one law, one piece of legislation, signed on a small island in New York Harbor in 1965 in the shadow of the Statue of Liberty. The Immigration and Nationality Act. The people who wrote it said it wouldn't change America. They promised on the record in the congressional debate that it would not shift the demographic balance, that it would not flood the country with immigrants from, quote, the third world. They were either lying or they were catastrophically wrong. 60 years later, Stephen Miller, the most powerful immigration official in the United States, is saying out loud what most politicians won't, that this law broke something, that the America before 1965 had a coherent national identity, and the America after it does not. The left says he's a racist, that the 1965 Act was a civil rights triumph, the end of a bigoted quota system that favored white Europeans and excluded everyone else. Victor Davis Hanson would ask a different question. Not whether the law was moral, not whether it was racist, but whether it was wise. Whether a nation can survive the transformation of its entire population in a single lifetime. And whether anyone bothered to ask the American people if this is what they wanted. This is the story of the law that changed everything. How it passed, what it did, and why we're still fighting about it 60 years later. To understand 1965, you have to understand what came before it. From 1924 to 1965, 41 years, the United States operated under something called the National Origins Quota System. Here's how it worked. Every year, the government would look at the 1,890 census, not the current population, but who was here in 1890, and allocate immigration slots based on national origin. If 15% of Americans in 1890 traced their ancestry to Germany, then 15% of that year's immigration slots went to Germans. If 2% traced to Italy, then 2% went to Italians. The explicit goal, and they were explicit about it, was to preserve the ethnic composition of the United States as it existed in the late 19th century, which meant, in practice, Northern and Western Europeans got most of the slots. British, German, Scandinavian, Irish, Southern and Eastern Europeans, Italians, Poles, Greeks, Jews got far fewer. And everyone else, almost nothing. The entire continent of Asia was essentially banned. Africa received a token allocation. The Middle East, barely anything. This was not an accident. This was the policy of the United States government, passed by overwhelming bipartisan majorities and enforced for 4 decades. And here's the part that's hard to talk about today. It worked, at least by its own metrics. Between 1,924 and 1,965, the foreign-born population of the United States dropped from 15% to under 5%, the lowest in American history. This was the period Stephen Miller calls the cauldron, through which a unified shared national identity was formed. The Great Depression, World War II, the Cold War, the Civil Rights Movement, the moon landing. Americans, whatever their ancestry, went through these things together. They fought in the same wars. They watched the same movies. They listened to the same music. They learned the same history in the same schools. The Italian kid in Brooklyn and the Norwegian kid in Minnesota might have had grandparents who spoke different languages, but they spoke the same one. They pledged allegiance to the same flag. They knew the same stories. E pluribus unum, out of many, one. The quota system, for all its obvious bigotry, created the conditions for that assimilation. Immigration was low. The people who came had time to integrate. Their children grew up American. That was the theory, that was the practice, and for 40 years, That was America. But by the 1,950 seconds, the consensus was fraying. The civil rights movement was gaining momentum. The idea that the government could discriminate based on race or national origin was becoming untenable. If it was wrong to segregate schools, how could it be right to segregate immigration? The Cold War added pressure. America was competing with the Soviet Union for the hearts and minds of the Third World, Africa, Asia, Latin America. It was hard to win that argument while telling those countries, your people aren't welcome here. And there was genuine moral revulsion. The quota system had kept out Jewish refugees during the Holocaust. It had excluded Asian allies who fought alongside us in World War II. It had told millions of people, you are not good enough for America. By 1960, change was coming. The only question was what kind. John F. Kennedy made immigration reform a priority. He wrote a book, A Nation of Immigrants, arguing for a new system based on skills and family reunification, not national origin. He didn't live to see it passed, but Lyndon Johnson did. By 1965, LBJ had the political capital to do almost anything. The Civil Rights Act had passed, the Voting Rights Act was coming, the Great Society was being built, immigration reform was next. But here's what's crucial and what gets memory hold in most discussions of this law. They promised it wouldn't change America. Senator Edward Kennedy, floor manager of the bill, said this on the Senate floor. The bill will not flood our cities with immigrants. It will not upset the ethnic mix of our society. It will not relax the standards of admission. It will not cause American workers to lose their jobs. Every single one of those statements turned out to be wrong. But at the time, it was enough. The bill passed. Johnson signed it at the foot of the Statue of Liberty. And everything changed. So what did the 1,965 Act actually do? On paper, it looked simple. It abolished the national origins quota system. No more allocating slots based on where your ancestors came from. Instead, the new system would prioritize two things: family reunification and skills. If you had family in America, you could come. If you had skills America needed, you could come. It sounded fair. It sounded rational. It sounded like the kind of thing a modern, enlightened nation would do. But there was a catch. The people who wrote the law explicitly assumed, that the new immigrants would look pretty much like the old immigrants, Europeans, maybe some Asians, but mostly Europeans. They were catastrophically wrong. Here's what actually happened. The family reunification provision created something called chain migration. One immigrant comes, he becomes a citizen, he sponsors his brother sponsors his wife sponsors her parents sponsor their other children. One immigrant becomes 5 become 20 become 100. And because the law no longer discriminated by national origin, the chains could start anywhere: Latin America, Asia, Africa, the Middle East. The first wave was small, but each wave sponsored the next wave, and each wave was larger than the one before. By 1970, the foreign-born population had barely moved, still around 5%. By 1990, it was 8%. By 2000, it was 11%. By 2020, it was 14%. Today, it's over 15% higher than it was in 1924 when they passed the quota system in the first place. And the composition is completely different. In 1960, 2/3 of immigrants came from Europe. Today, that number is under 10%. The largest source countries now: Mexico, China, India, the Philippines, Vietnam, El Salvador, Cuba, the Dominican Republic. The America of 1,960, 85% white, overwhelmingly European in ancestry is gone. It's not coming back. And it happened because of one law. One law that its sponsors promised would change nothing. Victor Davis Hanson would approach this differently. He wouldn't start with whether the 1,965 Act was moral. He would start with whether it was wise. And whether anyone asked the American people what they wanted, Here's the question no one asked in 1965. What happens when you transform the population of a nation faster than its institutions can adapt? Rome had centuries to absorb the Germanic tribes. It still fell. Spain had generations to process the expulsion of the Moors. It still fractured. America was given one lifetime. One. And it was never put to a vote. The senators who passed the 1965 Act are dead. The president who signed it is dead. The voters who elected them are almost all dead. But the consequences? Those are forever. Hanson's framework isn't about race. It's about assimilation. The question isn't where immigrants come from, it's whether they become American when they get here. And by that measure, something has changed. The old model, learn English, adopt the culture, join the story, has been replaced by something else. Multiculturalism. The idea that immigrants should maintain their separate identities. That America isn't a culture to join, but a geography to occupy. Press 1 for English. Bilingual education, ethnic studies, hyphenated identities. The Italian-American kid in 1950 wanted to be American. His grandparents' language was an embarrassment. Their old country was a memory. The Mexican-American kid in 2025 is told to be proud of his roots, to maintain his language, to see America not as a gift, but as a debt owed. That's not immigration. That's colonization in reverse. And Hanson has argued that no civilization has survived that. None. Not one. You can have immigration, you can have multiculturalism, but you cannot have both. So where does this end? Stephen Miller wants to go back, not to the explicit racial quotas of 1,924, that's politically impossible, but to the principle behind them, immigration that serves the national interest. Immigration that preserves social cohesion. Immigration that asks, what can you do for America? The left wants to go forward. More immigration. Faster naturalization. Amnesty for the undocumented. A pathway to citizenship for anyone who makes it here. And the center? The center doesn't exist anymore. There is no compromise position on this. You either believe America is a nation with a culture worth preserving, or you believe it's a proposition open to anyone who shows up. The 1965 Act is 60 years old. It has transformed the country beyond recognition, and the people who passed it, the people who promised it would change nothing, are beyond accountability. All that's left is the question they never answered. What is America? Is it a people, a culture, a creed? Or is it just a place, a geography with good jobs and a constitution that can be reinterpreted by whoever shows up? The answer to that question will determine whether America survives the next 60 years. Because if Victor Davis Hanson is right, if civilizations that lose their identity don't recover, then the clock is already ticking. And 1965 is when it started. The 1965 Immigration Act was sold as a civil rights fix, a correction to a racist system. But it was something else. It was a bet, a wager that America could absorb unlimited diversity without fracturing. That identity doesn't matter, that history doesn't matter, that culture doesn't matter. 60 years later, the results are in. Stephen Miller says the bet failed. The left says it succeeded. Victor Davis Hanson says we should have read the fine print. One law, 60 years, a different country. And no one asked permission.